So this is something we would like to do, to build and to take together, to collaborate with the network of women's colleges in the country, to learn from each other and contribute to each other's growth. Next slide. In fact, we are looking forward to hosting a conference next year. We are calling it 50 by 50, which is our vision for 2050 to have 50% representation of women at higher levels. If I look across the room, there are about 20% women today. I was very happy to see on the dais there were 2 women, which was. If I look around, there are probably 20% women, and these are all principals and senior levels. So of course, when they enter, there are good 50% of girls, but somewhere they are dropping out, somewhere even when they are joining teaching as a profession, they are not able to break the so-called glass ceiling. So 50 by 50 is our vision. By 2050, we hope to have 50% women in conferences like these. So we are committed to ensuring that this is going to happen with our philosophy of Sa Vidya Ya Vimuktiye. That alone is knowledge which leads to liberation. Thank you.
So please keep questions. Please, Siri.
Madam, everything is very, very laudable.
You have projected yourself and about your college, and it is very, very laudable. And all here together are appreciating the way your college is being run. But where from you are meeting the funding, finances, how you are managed?
Sir, finances is always a problem since we are a government college. The same fees is what we can charge. Our fees is on the website. You know, everyone knows higher education is 97% subsidized. So the fees that they contribute to the college is maybe 10,000 per annum or 8,000 per annum is what our students are giving, which is not even enough to meet the salaries, forget anything else. So as I said, many of these opportunities do not require funds. NSS, which is our biggest strength, is looking at drawing on expertise from volunteers. I said that we use our students as our biggest resources, be it in matters of administration or be it for other things. We also try to draw on our alumni, as I said, for funding. We also look at corporates. So this entire Equal Opportunity Center that is coming up is the corporate social responsibility of one company. So we approach companies for funding and they fund us in the name of their corporate social responsibility. But funding sources are the same. We are facing the similar problems that all of you are with regard to funding.
Madam, you said that Dhyan is one of your 4 pillars. What do you do with that Dhyan?
Dhyan is a context of looking inwards. So we find that often there is this rush into filling their CVs, into doing 10 courses at one time. They want to finish their classes, they want to learn a foreign language, they want to do computer literacy. There is no time to pause and think critically. So Dhyan provides this context where students come together. These are students who are slightly introspective, who want to look inwards, who want to think about where you are going to be and who want to make a difference. Somewhat spiritually inclined, this is not for everyone. So in
I got it. Then what is the participation of the students belonging to different religions in this particular activity?
Dhyan is
do you find only students coming from one particular religion to that particular program, or any other students coming from different religions?
It's a very good question, sir, but we have actually found that we don't preach religion under Dhyan. Not at all. In fact,
normally we say that we don't preach, but what is actual?
No, it is not about religious.
Going on there.
It is not about religious teaching at all. As I said last year, the thrust of Dhyan was reading this book called The Difficulty of Being Good by Gurcharan Das. So this entire book deals with Mahabharata and contextualizes Mahabharata in present day context. So it looks at the issue of gender, Draupadi and the 5 husbands. It looks at the issue of good versus evil. It looks at Karan as a central character and why he did what he did. So it's not, despite it being Mahabharata being a Hindu book, it doesn't have Hinduism as a religion into it. There is talk of Buddhism also a lot in Dhyan. There is talk about the power of forgiveness, compassion, love. So it's not religious at all, but it teaches you to be
I just
happy.
want to know how the students belonging to different religions take this. That's all I want.
Students belonging to all religions come to this.
Okay.
I have to admit it is not that popular a society as say a dance society or a dramatic society. About 40 students every year enroll for this program. It's not a very popular society.
Thank you.
And any issues are women health in that area, it is a urban area. So have you concentrated any projects or anything on women's health?
We have looked at issues of women's health. We have looked at issues of female infanticide. In particular, we focused on the area of body image. There are a lot of researches that say that women, particularly in this age group, are very, very vulnerable to eating disorders because they are very preoccupied into looking good and especially looking thin. And we found that there's umpteen research available on that. So we've run programs where we've given workshops to students. We first ask them questions on, do you obsess about your looks? And we put charts like that to recruit people. And do you frequently think about whether you're looking fat, are you not happy with the way you look and so on? And then people who sign up for this and say, yes, I'm often plagued by these problems, and is it enough that it doesn't make you concentrate, or you see into the mirror a lot of times and so on? And for those select group of students, then we ran workshops which focused on media literacy, which focused on issues towards making them feel good about themselves. So that's one area of women's health that we address.
Data on anemic conditions or other ill health conditions among the student community or among the nearby slum areas like that?
Not nearby slum areas, but
Among
under
students also, because in our Andhra Pradesh, in our colleges, who have adopted that projects, conducted survey works among the anemic conditions, among hostelites or among the commuters or among the day scholars like that, and have documented all that health status of the student communities.
That's fantastic work, and I hope to take this from here. In fact, at our last blood donation camp that we had, we weren't trying to collect data, but when we did the last blood donation camp, we found a very large percentage of our students to be anemic. So it's a very good point. We need to undertake issues of women's health and maybe their anemia or other kinds of conditions. Thank you.
Madam, I think it's a question from my side. In recent past, there was been a student movement in Delhi against atrocities against women. Being a premier institution of the women, to what extent our institution and platforms we created in the institution have been instrumental in building up these kind of movements? Did they take active role in recent past students against women? Sexual harassment, atrocities against men. Delhi became a center of these kind of movements.
Certainly. In fact, Delhi is often called the rape capital of India, so there is no escaping from the fact that we all live in Delhi and live under somewhat dangerous conditions where issues of molestation, issues of crime against women, rape, sexual harassment are very, very high. So in fact, whether you talk about the specific case of Nirbhaya, which was the gang rape case, indeed other students got together, they protested on India case. There is a lot of engagement with such issues. It just doesn't stop there, as I said. Through the Women's Development Cell, we try to engage with these issues. We try to talk to, say, fathers in the nearby slum areas to promote women's education, to try to make them come to our college through our the child development program, where particularly girl children are coming to campus and studying. So, issues of safety, issues of security are very, very important. There is a lot of discussion of these areas. A lot of it, I have to admit, is at the verge of discussion and demonstrations. But whether we've been really able to make a dent into public policy, no, we haven't. But certainly momentum, discussion, demonstration is something that we all regularly participate in.
Madam, you made a mention about internship of students with various NGOs. How did you do it? Whether it is tied with regular curriculum or during holidays?
When they intern, See, under the 4-year program now, they are going to be at 3, they were going from 3 to 5. Or Saturday was a day which was meant to be going to NGOs. NGOs always, they don't pay the students. So NGOs are always happy to get whatever help they get at whatever time students can come. Whenever they pay, there is this thing about you have to come at this time and go at this time. But this is all voluntary, there is no payment involved. So they are very happy with whatever time students can come. And typically it is from on Saturdays or in the evening hours. But in the new FYEP program, there is going to be credit given for what are called as cultural activities. So whether you are involved with cultural activities for community interface or dance or music or drama, there are going to be credits given to students from this academic session onwards.
Last question.
And you said that your cutoff marks for admission is rather high, in the range of 97 to 90. Like that, even for reserved category would be 85 plus percentage.
No sir, for reserved category the cutoffs are as low as 45%.
Do you mean to say that when you spoke about these spoken English or English communication skills in English, you have students of this kind, the computer illiterate people? What would be the percentage of this kind of students on your campus?
About 15% I would say are students coming from reserved categories, typically SCs. But of course, as you know, not all SCs are not conversant with English. There could be other students coming from OBC category or even students coming from general category who are not very conversant with English. Which is why English is something, unfortunately or fortunately, there is a premium in our country. So employers, when they come in, they look at how confident students are in speaking English or how good their computer literacy skills are. We have a large percentage. 15% is certainly those students who are not very good with English. So we have a lot of workshops with them, not only for speaking but also writing, presentation, coming forward, public speaking, talking in front of other people, simply to give them confidence, simply to make them develop their personality, so to speak. Thank you everyone for such patient hearing and for the breadth of questions. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for the wonderful presentation of best practice of Lady Sri Ram College. So now we'll break for lunch. We'll meet at 2:55.
Can I have your attention, please? I think it's only fair that we should put down the noise level and then listen to the speaker carefully. Kindly help us. Those of you who are still to finish the lunch, they can finish count and then please listen to me.
Dear friends, first of all, let me thank all of you and let me express my deep sense of gratitude to the organization or to the organizers of this workshop, especially to Mr. Chakraparty, who is the director of SIPS and is also director of this workshop, for giving me an opportunity to be with you here this afternoon. This is my second visit to Andhra. I visited some 15-16 years back to attend another similar workshop at Kakatiya University, Warangal, and this is my second visit here. So I am very happy to be with you today. The topic assigned to me, higher education in SAARC region, some innovative practices. In fact, the topic is very wide and also very specific. Wide in the sense that I have to talk about 8 countries which are members of SAARC, and specific because I have to highlight the innovative practices there. As you know, Asia is the largest landmass on the earth, covering about 30% of the total land area of the globe and supporting 60% of the total population of the world. And South Asia is only a part of it. It's really 8 nations which are covered under the organization of SAARC, South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation. This SAARC region is also very wide in the sense that it covers 24% of the total population of the world and 36% of that of Asia. So this area of 8 countries is also very wide. This is, in fact, this consists of several countries which are among the least developed in the world. And also, the illiteracy is also very high, least literate, I should say. While literacy rate in the world, average literacy rate is 84%, it is 79 for Asia and 62% for the SAARC countries. So that means even within Asia, this SAARC region is the least literate. This is also underdeveloped area, and if you look at the HDI figures recently published by the UNDP, we find that the most developed within this region is Maldives, which ranks 92 in the list, 92, and the least developed is Afghanistan, which ranks 175, and India ranks 136th in the HDI list published by the UNDP this year. So this is the situation. The poorest region and also least developed, least literate, as well as it's among, 6 of the countries of these 8 countries, the SAARC region, are among the 10 least literate countries of the world. So this is the situation. Keeping in view their underdevelopment, these countries formed an organization in 1985, which is known as South Asian Association of Regional Cooperation. The purpose was to form an organization, a kind of trade bloc for cooperation in political, social and economic matters. In fact, the idea for forming this SAARC was first put forward by the then President of Bangladesh, Mr. Ziaur Rahman. Later on, the idea was approved by India, Pakistan and Sri Lanka, and then finally in December 1985, the organization was formed, and the members agreed on cooperation in 5 major areas of development. These are agriculture and rural development, one. Second was telecommunication, science and technology, health and population, transportation and human resource development. So human resource development is one of the 5 areas under which, on which these 8 countries would cooperate. Initially, the organization had 7 members: Bangladesh, Bhutan, India, Maldives, Sri Lanka and Pakistan. Afghanistan was added only recently in 2007 as one of the members, and therefore membership has now increased to 8. Now we talk about the education system of these countries. In fact, these countries share many things in common. In addition to the geographical boundaries, they share, climatic conditions, and many, cultural elements also are common. In fact, under the Indian subcontinent, India, Bangladesh and Pakistan, they almost have the same culture. In fact, Pakistan and Bangladesh will carve out of undivided India, that you know. At present, their education system is almost similar. Similar in the sense that all these countries, except minor variations in Sri Lanka, all have 12 years of schooling. That means after entering a university, every child must pass or must study at school for 12 years. 10 plus 2, 10 years, normally there is a first public examination in all the countries, and then after two additional years there is second public examination, except in Sri Lanka, I said. There is minor variation in Sri Lanka. In Sri Lanka, 10 plus, it's 11 years plus 2 years. 11 years schooling and then 2 years college. After studying for 11 years, a child must pass an examination, GEC ordinary level, General Certificate in Education. This is the first public examination conducted by the government in Sri Lanka, and which is conducted by one examining body after 11 years of study. And then those who qualify go for junior college, which is of 2 years, 12th and 13th year. And after 13th year, there is another examination which they call GCE advanced level, General Certificate in Education advanced. After that, after passing that examination, a student qualifies himself for entry in the university. There are no affiliated colleges. There is no system of affiliating colleges there. There are schools and something like a junior college and then university. Entry to the university in Sri Lanka is very selective, based on go on GCE advanced level, and only the brightest one find a place in the university. But those who don't find a place in the university, for them there is Sri Lankan Open University, and then and which is funded by the public. I mean, which is fully funded by the government. Education in Sri Lanka in the public universities as well as in the open universities is free, and those who don't find seats within the country, even within the open university, they go abroad for higher studies. So this is the situation there. In all the SAARC countries, higher education is in fact selective. It's not for all. And normally, after 12 years schooling, there are 3 to 4 years of first degree. 3 years in general education, like we have in BA, BSc and BCom, general education for 3 years, and 4 years courses for professional education, like engineering and medicine and other professional courses. So 3 to 4 years of first degree, and then 2 to 3 years of master's degree, 2 years for general education and 3 years generally for professional education, and then 3 to 5 years of doctoral programs. So this is the pattern everywhere in all the SAARC countries, including Sri Lanka, except there is variation at the school level. So this is the education system which these countries follow. Then there is a college, there is a system of affiliation of colleges. Everywhere, colleges are affiliated to universities. In India also, you know, we have a college affiliation system. In fact, in India, we have 3 different kinds of universities. Universities which are unitary in the sense that which are teaching universities, which do not affiliate colleges. This is one, and which are not very large in number. Then there are universities which have both the functions, teaching as well as affiliation. And the third category is of those which have only the system of affiliating colleges. They only function as examining bodies, and teaching and research work is conducted in the college. So that way there are 3 different kinds of universities in India. Almost similar pattern is followed in other SAARC countries also. Here we were talking about affiliated to college in the morning also. You know, this is a problem in fact, especially in the Indian conditions. With some of the universities, some 500, 600, and even 700 colleges are affiliated, and the entire energy of the university, staff, teachers, and the administration is consumed in the managing the affairs of colleges, including maintaining discipline and conducting their examinations. And there is hardly any time left for improving quality. So that's a problem. So quality of education is also not up to the mark in any of the SAARC countries as far as higher education is concerned, because none of the universities, except one Indian IIT, figures among top 500 universities of the world, the list which has been recently published. Now I will talk about one system which is followed by Bangladesh in affiliation, in the case of affiliation. In Bangladesh, there is a university which affiliates all the colleges of Bangladesh, single university, which affiliates all the colleges, and no teaching work is done in the campus of those in the campus of that university. And only only undergraduate courses are conducted in those colleges. And all other universities are independent universities. They do not affiliate any colleges, although they have some constituent colleges, which mostly conduct professional education. So this is one practice which Bangladesh follows. We have to think whether we can follow that practice here, because in India, higher education system is very large. At present, we have around 680 university or equivalent institutions, and more than 35,000 colleges. So, in fact, we in India have a college system, not a university system, because it is in the colleges that more than 90% of the students are enrolled, both undergraduate and postgraduate. Universities enroll only some 9% of them, of the students. So, if you use the Bangladesh pattern in the whole country, if we have a single university affiliating all the colleges, then it may not be practically possible, because the country is very large. Although CBSE conducts examination for all the central schools in the country, but in the case of colleges, this doesn't appear to be very practicable. What is possible is that we can have one such university in each state, so that all the colleges in that state are affiliated to that one university, and all the other universities are free from college affiliation system and can concentrate on quality dimensions. So this is one practice which Bangladesh follows. Then the other thing about Bangladesh is that Bangladesh National University, which is the affiliating university, is self-supporting. That is, it meets all its expenses out of the money received from the registration and examination fee of the students. And that is why Bangladesh is the country which spends least on education in terms of gross enrollment, GDP, gross domestic product. I tell you what is the pattern. Bangladesh spends 2.4% of the GDP, which is the least among the SAARC countries. And the highest GDP spent on education is by Maldives. It is 11.2%, and Bhutan is 4.8%. India spends only 4%. So this is the pattern. Pakistan also spends a very small amount. Pakistan spends 2.7%. Sri Lanka 3.2%. So, with the exception of Maldives, no country in the SAARC region spends 5% of the GDP on education. So one thing about this is that they have to enhance educational expenditure in terms of GDP. In India, in 1951, educational expenditure in terms of GDP was about 1.2%. When Education Commission assessed this situation in 1966, there was hardly much headway on this direction. And Education Commission recommended that Indian government should spend at least 6% of the GDP on education. And this recommendation was made by the Education Commission some 50 years ago. But so far, only the figure of 4% has been touched. After Education Commission, the first national policy on education also proposed that the Government of India must spend at least 6% of the GDP on education. Several times our government has committed, and some years ago also, our Prime Minister declared publicly that this government would spend at least 6% of the GDP on education. And for that purpose, Government of India started collecting education cess, which is known to us. Now, all taxpayers are paying 3% education cess as a surcharge on their income tax. And this practice started from 2004. But you look at the graph of the educational expenditure after 2004, in fact, it has declined. In the year 2001, the highest figure was touched by the government. It was 4.12 in 2001. And thereafter, 2004, the government proposed that larger amount will be spent, but for that education cess would be charged. Government started charging education cess, but expenditure on education as percentage of GDP has been continuously declining. And it is, at present, it is around 3.8. So, this is the situation of educational expenditure. So, all government in the South region must spend more on education, because nothing can happen without money. In our area, we say in Hindi, "Jitna gud daloge, utna meetha hoga," means sweetness is directly proportional to the amount of sugar put in. So money is important, and many good programs are not don't function because of shortage of funds. So this is one problem in our country, in the South region, everywhere. Now, quantitatively also, if you look at the quantity, excessive dimension, the Madam Jayanti was talking in the morning, that during the last 10 years, we have enhanced our GER from only 17% to 20% now. It's a great achievement, of course. In the year 2000, the GER of higher education in India was 7%. GER means it's a percentage of students enrolled within the age group of 18 to 24 years, divided by the total population that age. So this is the GER, gross enrollment ratio. And it has increased at the rate of at least 1% per annum in India. But Ma'am was telling in the morning that there was a meeting in the Planning Commission, and everybody was very happy to see that GER had increased to 20% in such a short period. So here I am tempted to tell you one thing which happened with me personally. One day in the morning, as usual, a vegetable vendor shouted in the front of my house, "Aloo gobi," as usual. We came out. My wife also came out. She asked him for a particular variety of potato. He said he didn't have that variety that day, and he could bring later on. Then my wife ordered 5 kgs of potato, asking him to bring next day. Then he said, "I cannot bring you bring potato tomorrow. I can give you day after tomorrow, because tomorrow I have exam." This fascinated me a little, because a young man selling vegetable, moving from street to street, and at the same time studying, is a very good thing for a country like India. Anyway, so I said, "What exam?" He told me that He was doing BSc. I was very happy. A science student, he was doing his BSc in science, and also earning in the morning. He would get up every day at 4, go to the market, purchase vegetables, and have, around selling them. And then, which subject, I asked him, which college are you attending? Then he said, I am attending a college in Harduaganj, which is around 10 kilometers from Aligarh city. Then I got shaken. I said, then perhaps you don't have to go there at all to attend classes. He said, yes, sir, you don't have to go. He has paid money, huge money. And he doesn't have to attend classes. A BSc student doesn't have to attend classes. They are practical lessons. What I want to emphasize is that while assessing our progress, we have to be very careful. This is our 20% GER. The person is enrolled in a college, that too in the BSc, and he doesn't have to attend college. Then I said, then how will you pass the examination? He said, there is a guarantee of first class. First class. They are guaranteed first class. The only thing they have to do is to pay money. That's all. Then I said, what will you do with that degree? It will not fetch you any job. His further answer was more interesting. He said, sir, I will get job. I have reservation. So no problem. So when we assess our progress, we have to be very careful. So this is what I want to tell you. And in terms of GER, the world GER is 26%. And we in India are at 20. If we accept what our man told in the morning, if that is true, then it's 20. And for developed countries, the average is 56. And for other developing countries, the average figure is 30. So and in other countries, I tell you what is the situation. GER in Afghanistan is 3.3. 3.3, the lowest in the world. Bangladesh it is 12. For Bhutan it is 9. For India it is 18. It is official, published in the Ministry of Education document. And then Nepal it is 5. Pakistan 5 and Sri Lanka 11. So this is the situation of GER. Now that means large scale expansion is required. Not only in India, everywhere, in all the countries. And for that, we can take advantage of open and distance learning. This is the one which can come to our. China has done it. In fact, at the beginning of this century, as far as GER is concerned, China and India were at par. We had 7, they had 10. Now we have 20, they have 26. And that is mainly because of this distance education system. Then another thing I tell you. Then we come to the quality. Quality of education imparted in universities and colleges in all the SAARC countries is not up to the mark, including India. India is the largest. And India in fact has one of the largest higher education systems of the world. Only after China and USA. USA is number 1. China is number 2 as far as size of the system is concerned, and we are the third. But quality is is not good. One of our education minister remarked a few years ago that only 9% graduates are worth giving a job. This was the remark of one of our educators. What about the other 91%? That means there has to be some quality control mechanism. We have one NAC. NAC has been created by Government of India to oversee the quality of education. It was created in 1994. In fact, it started functioning from 1994, some 19 years ago. And so far, it has been able to assess some 15% of the total number of universities in the country. How long will it take NAC to assess all the universities is anybody's guess. But then, whatever assessment has been made, the other day, I was reading an article by somebody regarding assessment of NAC. I was surprised to see that out of all the universities assessed and accredited by NAC, 60% have got an A, and the remaining one B. No university got a C. Now, what is meant by our A? To me, A means Harvard. A means Oxford. Not Bombay, not JNU, not Delhi, because they don't figure anywhere in the list of top 500 universities. So what is our A? So we have to see this. 60% of the university assessed by the NAC are getting A, and none getting C. That means we do not have, inferior or bad universities. We have good universities only. 60% of universities are good. So we have to define what do we mean by A and B. Redefine. Then, other thing is, what it means. What can we do? Oh, I have taken too long. Anyway, now the new thing that has come to our higher education system is privatization. Only a recent phenomenon. So first we have to think why we resorted to this, why we have privatized higher education. One reason was that our system was very small. It was large and small. This is very interesting. It is large in terms of number of universities. If we compare in terms of number with USA and China, it's very large. But when we say that it caters to only 18% of the relevant age group, then that means it is small, very small. It keeps 82% out of their end. That means more expansion is required. Not only in India, everywhere in these eight countries. And that's why, secondly, higher education has been highly subsidized in all these countries, everywhere. I was surprised to read in a magazine that a university student in Bangladesh pays only $2.5 a year as fees. $2.5 a year. That means only 150 rupees at today's exchange rate for the whole year. 12 rupees only. So much of subsidy. In India also, entire education is subsidized in the extent of 90 to 95%. And out of whatever funds are available, more than 90% are consumed on salaries of teachers and staff. Nothing is left for quality improvement. So government thought that some alternative hedge has to be found. This was one reason. Second thing was, so far, if you look at the student body in the universities and colleges, you found that most of them come from the top 15 to 20% of the socio-economic group. That means universities and colleges so far have been accessible only to the top 15 to 20% of the economic group. That means rich people. Then what do we mean by subsidizing higher education? What it means is we take out money from the poor and put it in the pockets of the rich. That is what it means. Because we subsidize higher education from the public money out of tax, of which 60 to 70% comes from the lowest 80% of the people, and spend that money on the top 20%. Now that means take out money from the poor and put it in the pocket. This is what it means. So that is why government thought, okay, let us prioritize so that those who are benefited must pay. That's what they research. Another thing is, and privatization is justified on that ground. That those, but private colleges and universities are mostly conducting professional courses for the obvious reason that these are the courses which are preferred by the students because they have a job market. Nobody's, no private college or no private body is starting general education courses, BA, BSc, BCom. Nobody is willing. So this is one problem. Then a research dimension of universities in the entire region has weakened over the years. The reason is that the brightest students are going to professional courses and nobody is choosing research as a career at that level, at +2 level. You know that in India, first screening takes place after class 12. IIT, AIMS, medical colleges, and they take away the first layer of cream. God. And then the second layer goes away after first degree. MCA, MBA, other professional courses, competitions, PCS, IAS, everything. So whatever is left goes to postgraduate studies, MA, MSc, MCom. And from those we have to identify persons for research. How can we do the research then? Because research is the highest academic endeavor and that requires highest caliber of research as well as a high degree of motivation. So unless students have ability and motivation, requisite ability and motivation, we cannot expect any meaningful research. Now government is thinking, if we award scholarships, automatically quality research will be done. think you know that recently, now we have 83 central universities. And for every student admitted to PhD in all these central universities, UGC provides scholarship compulsorily. I think you all know. Although the amount is not very large, 8,000 now. 8,000 rupees are given to every student registered for PhD in all the central universities. Now this is happening. Perhaps the government of India thinks that if we award more scholarship, better research will be happening. Now what is happening now is that we are under tremendous pressure for admissions. From the students, from the student bodies, from unions, for making admissions to PhD. Our friends are giving us telephone calls saying, adjust this student fit for PhD, she is very poor. At least 8,000 she will get or he will get for their families. So this is what is happening. Anyway, one point more. Privatization has been taken up on a large scale in all the SAARC countries. And in Pakistan, Bangladesh, 75% universities are now private. So privatization is an irreversible process now. In India also we have 100 private universities. And a recent development is that a South Asian university has been set up by South Asian countries at Delhi, which is growing fast, and after it will develop to the full, it will have 7,000 students and 700 faculty members. This is the proposal, and this is supposed to be an international university with world-class infrastructure. This is the proposal, and it has already been implemented. So thank you very much for this.
No questions?
No questions.
Thank you, sir. So we'll move on to the next session, the Akshaya model by Sri P.M. Naushad. I request Naushad, please come on to the dais. He's a Journal Coordinator for Akshaya State Project Office. First, Dr. Srinivasa Prasad to introduce the speaker.
Thank you, sir. It's my pleasant privilege to introduce Sri P.M. Naushad, Zonal Coordinator, Akshaya State Project Office, Kerala, who is now going to make his presentation on Akshaya model. I'll just take 1 minute to introduce our distinguished guest who is going to speak on Akshaya model today. He is presently working as a manager, e-governance and zonal coordinator in State Akshaya Project, IT Mission, Department of Information Technology, Government of Kerala. He was in charge for setting up the CSCs, which is otherwise known as Citizen Service Centers in Lakshadweep, and instrumental in conducting workshops, viability studies, creating business models, analysis of technology for last mile connectivity, and is also instrumental in selection of village level entrepreneurs and supervision of execution. Now he looks after the entire Akshaya CSCs, citizen service centers in the state for delivering Z2C, which is government to citizen services in Aadhaar, e-district project in particular. He started his career in Rubber Board Government Office in 1989